Hello. Today we're making a sliding door. This is a preview of what we're going to make here. It's just a simple door control that you can interact with, and then it slides and opens up and down. This is a little bit more fancy version, kind of the implementation in an actual environment, and it gives I think a really cool kind of dramatic effect. Also fairly intuitive. You can slide it and the player is it's pretty clear how it works. So that's what I like about it. It's also not that hard to set up. So let's get started. We're going to make this in Unreal Engine 4.27. Here I'm just making a first person template. Nothing special. I like to clean up the map a little bit. And I'm going to move these in position so we can get our door set up in the right spot. Move the spawn. They always have the scale messed up on the spawn. Then the first thing we're going to make, I just make a folder called custom art. I dump when I'm just like learning something or practicing something. That's what I put it all in that folder so I can find it easily. BP underscore sliding door is what we're going to use here. We're going to start by just taking a standard cube, scaling it a little bit, moving it up, and we're going to put it in place, and we're just going to drag it into the scene, make sure it looks good, get it in the right spot. A lot of these sections are sped up. I'm going to slow the video down when we get into the actual blueprints, but none of this section is that complicated. I think set up a little block as the controls, and this is where the actual UI is going to go in the controls. We're going to end up moving that actually later. But yes, we will need a camera on the door, and we're actually going to like kind of transition between the camera and the player. You're not going to possess the door, but we do want the player to be looking at a specific spot so they can interface with the UI. Okay, so we're just getting this set up. We needed to be in a good spot so we kind of want to see the door as well and the controls as well. So what I did there is I pinned the camera into the preview when you click on it, so that way as you move it in the blueprint you can see what's going on. I'm just cleaning out the first person blueprint a little bit. We don't need any of this VR stuff. I'm going to leave the arms. I deleted the shooting effects though. And we're just cleaning this up a little bit so it's easier to know what we're doing in here. Okay, so now that we have that, I'm getting rid of the interaction HUD since it's actually in the wrong spot, but that doesn't matter since we're not going to use it. So I disconnected it there. Cleaning up the lighting so it doesn't change every time I play. And then we're going to create the rest of the assets we need here. So we're going to need an interface, a blueprint interface. I'm just calling mine interaction interface. And this is what we're going to put on the door in order to let the player interact with it. We can cast directly to the door. That's kind of another way to do this, but I like interfaces for this use case, so we don't have to cast every single specific thing the player interacts with. We're also making two UI elements. We're making a button prompt, and then we're making the door control widget. The button prompt we're going to set up first here. It's a pretty simple thing. It's just literally going to have the name of the button to press. So in this case, we're going to use the letter E on the keyboard. I'm sure there's a dynamic way you could set this up. So it, reads what, your interaction button is, but we're just going to hard code it in for now since we're just learning how to make a door. So we're just going to put an E, and make it a bit larger, and then we're also going to give it a stroke, which is just a little line around the letters. So it's a little bit easier to see when it pops up. Okay, so now that we've made that, jump into the actual door blueprint, and we're going to add a widget here. This widget we're going to put near the controls, that box there, and we're going to want it doesn't actually, we're going to make sure it's in screen space, We don't need it to be world space, so it will show in front of anything, but just positionally, I like it to be in front. Okay, so now that we have that in front, we're also going to add a sphere collider right here. And that we're just going to put near the button. It doesn't need to be that exact because the player has its own sphere collider. And we're going to do an event whenever the player gets near it. Next thing we're going to do here, we're going to implement the interface. You can just, it's under the class settings here. And then the next thing we need to do is add the actual functions to the interface. We're going to need 3 different functions. We're going to need a function for activating the button prompt, deactivating the button prompt, and then we're going to need one for when we actually go into the door controls. The one for the door controls will need a player reference in. Now I'm just cleaning up the blueprints here, the ones we're using, and you notice when we compiled it, we have the interfaces right there. So we're going to implement the 2 interfaces. We're going to have one for the button prompt and then one for the deactivate button prompt. And all we're going to do here is set the visibility when those interfaces get activated. And we're going to do the same thing for both. The only difference is we need to turn off visibility when they get deactivated. And we also want to turn off visibility by default since we only want the prompt to appear when the player gets close. After that, we're going to go into the player and activate the events on overlap and on overlap end. And then we're going to do does implement interface. And we're going to put in our interaction interface, set up a branch here. And because we want to do something when the player overlaps with this interface. So now that we have that, we want to call the blueprint interface. So it's going to be activate prompt right there. And then we want to pull in the overlapping actor into the target. Then we're going to get a reference to the player or the reference to the door. And then we're going to copy this entire system and we're going to move it down to the on begin overlap end or on end overlap. And we're going to copy it. Since a lot of these are going to be similar, there's a few differences. We want to delete that because we want to clear the door reference when it exits. And then we also want to deactivate the prompt instead of activate the prompt. But other than that, all the other blueprint nodes are going to be the same. And now we're testing it out right here. And we notice it's not turning off because we just forgot to check it right there. But now when we get close, it turns on, and then when we move away, it turns off. So it's working correctly. Next, we do need to add a player reference to the blueprint interface here. So we're just going to call it player ref, and we're going to reference the first person character directly. You might want to make that more generic in your proper game, but for the purposes here, should be fine. Next, we're adding in the button, like when the player actually activates the controls. You can put these into the input under the project settings if you want, but I just kind of hard-coded in here. It's just E. We're setting the player visibility to hidden since we want to get rid of the arms, and then we're going to disable the input of the player because we don't want the player to be able to move around while they're activating the door controls. We're going to set the game mode to be UI as well, so that way they can actually interface with the door controls. And then we are going to turn the mouse cursor on so we can click the slider that we're going to add to the door controls. And we're going to activate the interface so that way we can actually activate the door controls themselves. And we're going to need a reference to the door, and then we're going to also add a reference to self there. We do want to add a validated get at the start, which you can right click a get to turn into a validated get, because we really only want this to work if the door is actually valid, if the player is within the door area. And we'll just get a reference to self there. So we're making a custom event here. And this custom event is going to be what we're going to fire from the door to get back into the player. So a lot of the same things are going to happen. We're going to enable input on the player, and we're going to re-enable visibility, and basically all the opposite of the things we're doing when we're going into the door controls. The final section of this, we're going to set up a view blend, which is going to just blend the view of the player. It doesn't actually possess the door, but it will mean that the player will look through the camera that is attached to the door. We're going to set that blend to 0.5, and we're going to need the player controller and a reference to self, since we want it to blend from, or this is coming out of the door into the player. So we're going to blend from the door into the player. So we'll need reference to self. And then we're going to set up the door controls here. This is going to be basically the same stuff that we do going out of the player, but into the door. So we're going to need that same view blend. We're going to make a player reference there, so that way we can get out of the door again when we want to. And we're going to use this view blend here. It's going to be exactly the same, but it's just going to be in the door blueprint. That way we can blend from the player into the door. And in the same way, we're going to want to enable the controls of the door, so the door is actually a valid thing to give input. So we're going to put that into the interaction interface for the activate controls. We're going to set up the controls here. Once again, we're going to just make it E, which is going to be the same button to get into the door as to get out. I think that makes sense, though you can set it to whatever you want. Okay, now that we're just going to paste in most of these things from the player blueprint, we also want to turn on and off the button prompts when we go into the door, since we don't actually want the button prompt visible while you're activating the controls of the door. And then we can turn the button prompt back on once you exit the door, since almost by definition you're going to be within the prompt radius if you're interacting with the door. So let's check that. We fade in, fade out, and the button prompt is working correctly. Very nice. I did forget to turn off the door, and I'm going to mess around with the position of the camera a little bit, trying to find a good spot to put the camera. Ultimately, I'm not going to like any of those spots, but let's move on to the actual door control widget. So what we're going to do for the door control is we're going to need a slider and a progress bar. We're going to put them both into the center of the screen, and we're going to layer them on top of each other. The progress bar, we're going to give the slider actually, we're going to give one additional value in the Z order, so that way it stays on top, and that way you can actually select it. We're going to put them both from vertical, or top to bottom. I think I actually messed that up. I have to change it in the end, but it's an easy fix. I'm going to make the slider a bit wider with the render transform settings, so that way you can kind of see the bar that's fully encompasses the bottom of the progress bar. And then I'm also going to make the line of the slider totally transparent, so that way it looks like the progress bar is the thing that you're interacting with. For the event, we're actually going to bind this to an event instead of checking on tick every time the progress bar moves. And we're just going to bind it on value changed, and we'll make a custom event here. And we'll just do update slider, and then we're going to link the progress bar to the slider, so that way we set the percentage of the progress bar to whatever the slider gets set to. Going back into the door blueprint, we're going to add the widget. We're going to then take the widget. We're going to make sure the progress bar is there. This one is going to be world space, and we will end up having to set the input on this widget so that way we can actually interact with it. But we get to that in the end. We're going to size it a little bit, make sure it's right. We have a bit of Z fighting, so bring it just above the surface so we don't have any problems with that. We're going to scale it up a bit and go from there. Here I'm going to mess around with the camera, trying to get in the perfect spot. I'm still not going to be happy with any of these locations, so I'll have to change it later. But the widget is working. You can see it in game, and it is on our controls correctly. So that's a good sign. All right, now let's move on to the actual fun spot, which is the moving of the door. The moving of the door is actually a fairly simple system. We're just going to have an endpoint and a start point, and then we're going to lerp between those 2 points based on what the slider is set to. So at the start here on begin play, we are going to set the initial location just to be whatever location it's at currently, so that way the door doesn't move until you move the controls. And then we're also going to bind the widget controls, and we're going to cast to the door control widget, and we're going to bind that to on values change, and we're going to make a custom event here. So whenever we change the values of the slider, this event will fire. And we just created a new event through the binding system there, and we're going to set the desired door location to the alert between the start and end point, which we're setting here. So the initial start point was just where the door is right now, and then the end point I just moved above the door like that. And then we're setting those two up, and then the slider value is going to alert between the two. However, the desired location is just going to be something we're going to blend with an F interp. I'm using a nearly equals, so that way when the door is close to the location it's supposed to be, it doesn't actually tick anymore. However, while it's ticking, it tries to lerp to the desired location. And that's the code there. So it's setting the relative location, and it's trying to lerp it to whatever the location is. And let's test it out here. And if you notice, it doesn't actually work. Even if I drag it down, I can't click it in game, and that's because the widget has a little setting you're supposed to check here. I was looking up, there it is. This setting right down there. And if you click that, then you should be able to interact with the widget in game. As you can see, I also mixed up the direction of the slider, or the progress bar, so I'm flipping that. And then I also wanted it to be a different color, so I'm going to change that just to black. And then the location of the actual camera, I'm going to mess around with it a little bit, and I'm just going to put it directly in front of the door, just so it's a bit more clear and you don't have to be at a weird angle, and it's a little easier to see. And here's the finished door. When you move it up, the door will lerp to the finished location. When you move it down, it will lerp down. You can move in, you can move out. The controls will work. You can move it to be halfway open. You can walk underneath it, and it works just like a sliding door. And then what we're going to do here finally, we're just moving the player spot so we can actually go in it, and we're going to make a build of this as well. The tutorial's over, but I like to make a build of the little daily projects I do to learn Unreal, just so I can learn and get in the habit of packaging a project. It's fairly simple. I just package it one folder above the actual project location. So we're going to package this and open it up here, test it out as a built project. It's working correctly. Open the door, mess around with it. You can open it a little bit, and I'm just going to save this into my list of projects I do every day. So I am doing a lot of these, so if you guys have any tutorials you wanted me to do or something you wanted me to cover, just give me a suggestion and maybe I can do a tutorial on it. And I hope to see y'all later.